On September 9, Isabella's flight on the way to Las Vegas fails 29 minutes after takeoff from Sao Paulo. Nearly 2 years later, no aircraft dress or any passengers or crew has been found. Chapter 1. The first character of our history is Antonio Silva. The Tom. Born in the year 1990. Antonio did not come from a structured family. His parents were young and soon they divorced. But they know how to give their children a good education. Antonio lived all his childhood in the city of Amparo, in the middle of Sao Paulo. Great student, entered college at 17 years. His biggest passion was travel. For this reason, he decided to course hotels. He got a scholarship to study in Kilkenny, Ireland. Tom is about to enter an airplane for the first time. To follow his biggest dream. Tom took a non-stop flight to the UK. After boarding, Tom hears the commander talking to the passengers, very happy. He said that it would be his last flight, because he would be retiring next. John Wesco was a veteran pilot born in London. He made a point of saying he was extremely grateful the airline for providing him with such an amazing life. He said that he had already spent more than 1,000 hours in the air, and that was more than any astronaut had spent off the ground. Also thanked all the awards he received in that time, and wished everyone an excellent I will. Soon then, it was the turn of Maria Helena, the youngest of the commissioners. While passing the checklist of items available in case of emergency, she was interrupted several times by a young man who was in the first row. Tom remembered he had red eyes. Maria Helena promises the passenger that he would be the first to be served after takeoff. In exchange, she asks that the passenger, during takeoff, stay without his seat, with the seatbelt buckled, and with its electronics off. Curiously, that was not the most nervous passenger on board. 4 rows back, a man, well-dressed, holding firmly his briefcase, hoped that the whole situation would be resolved, without the authorities being involved. In the armchair beside Tom, was Sarah Simon, a young writer, who has just completed her master's in Brazil, and was returning to Europe, to her family home. Sarah was a German family, who had refugee in Brazil in the 1990s of 40. But who returned to their home country 30 years after the end of the confrontation. Sarah grew up listening to her family's stories about Brazil, and when she graduated from high school, she was sure where she would want to study. Near 9:30 p.m., the plane almost overflowed the archipelago of Fernando de Noronha. The appetizers had already been served, and everyone was prepared to sleep. That's when the unthinkable happened. A man, very well dressed, calls for the flight steward. Maria Helena was who came to answer him. The man has gripped the flight steward's arm, and demands to talk to the airplane pilot. John Wesco was a very experienced pilot. He knew that any kind of incident, it was better to be taken care of on the ground, than in the air. And resolves to listen to that man's requirements. The man then handles a piece of paper with coordinates to the flight attendant. And requires the plane to go to that location. Everyone was very scared on board, because no one knew what man had inside his suitcase. That man had become the plane's hijacker. It also requires that all external communications be interrupted, then the airplane makes a very sharp left turn. It was a night of very distress for all passengers and crew. At a certain moment, the ignitor requires the pilot to take action to avoid the radar controllers on the ground. The pilot starts to fly very low. At 5:30 a.m., the plane touches the runway. Desperate, everyone leaves the aircraft quickly without even knowing where they are. The police informs passengers that they were at Hilo International Airport, in Hawaii, and that all would have to wait for the testimonies to be collected about everything that happened on board. Taking advantage of the turmoil, the kidnapper manages to escape, but doesn't go very far. He was captured after almost drowning while trying to swim across to a neighbor, wanting to mix with the tourists. He was recognized by the passengers who also took pictures of him on their cell phone. A short time later, the kidnapper's identity is revealed. He was a Brazilian politician, who was fleeing the country with stolen money. Surprisingly, that was the contents of that suitcase. Now the passengers were more than 9,000 kilometers from their original destination. Quickly, the airline provides a hotel for passengers to accommodate, and the same afternoon 2 airplanes arrive to rescue them. During the flight, the pilots of the 2 planes decide to entertain the passengers for a few minutes flying side by side with the sunset in the background. Almost 40 hours after leaving Sao Paulo, Tom finally arrives at his destination, with many stories to tell to his new accommodation friends. With all that confusion during the kidney, Sarah Simon remained totally calm, didn't enter in panico at no time, which also calmed down Tom, who in the first hours started to believe that it would be his first and last flight. But unfortunately Tom, who was very shy, didn't ask for a phone or Sarah Simon's social network, and after saying goodbye at the end of the trip, they totally lost contact with each other. Tom is enjoyed with Europe. He spends New Year's Eve in London and then goes with his friends to Kilkenny, Ireland, where he would take his hotel course. But 3 months after arriving from Europe, Tom received an urgent call from Brazil. His little brother needed a kidney transplantation, and he was the most compatible donor in the family. Of course there is no surgery, and with the recovery, Tom stays 6 months more in Brazil, because he would not be able to go back and complete his school year. And it was in that request that Tom met Isabella do Vale. She was a geographist and liked to spend the afternoon in the square playing her saxophone. She liked to hear the sounds of the city. The cars, the traffic. I would like to see the buildings' facades, all the movement, the life that the city had, and she used it as inspiration for her music notes. Isabella was from a Portuguese family. Her biggest dream was to play in the Orchestra Vila Harmónica de Lisbon. As a chat companion in the square, Tom gets space in Isabella's heart soon, who demonstrated to be a person very centered in his goals. Tom would like to see how she encourages him to chase his dreams too. Tom cultivates a feeling of gratitude to his brother for making him go back to Brazil. Isabella and Tom make their first trip to Rio de Janeiro, but during the trip, Isabella receives a call from one of the schools that she had tested. They wanted her to be Brasilia, to touch the appointment of minister. The 2 leave immediately for Brasilia, a week early to do all the tests. In the band, everyone likes Isabella, and proposes that Isabella continue with them, because they entered it, and the next presentations would be in the United States, one in the Vegas, in the presentation of a smartphone, and soon after, at Disney, at a party for employees who complete 10 years at the company. On September 9th, the 2 leave from Guarulhos to follow their dreams. Tom was going to spend a few weeks in Switzerland, to get to know hotel schools. Isabella's flight to Las Vegas disappears 29 minutes after takeoff from Sao Paulo. More than 2 years later, no aircraft dress, any crew or passenger has been found. Tom knows about the incident before setting up in Switzerland. It was a huge competition between all the passengers. After 3 years, Tom graduates from the School Atelier de Lausanne. And after graduation, the students decide to go to Paris for a farewell. As each one would return to their country, Jai, an Indian, Tom's best friend, convinces him to join the group. They go to L'Avenue, one of the best restaurants in Paris. It was packed that night because a writer had booked the living room to hold an autographs night and the release of her new book. A romance that told the story of a young woman who meets the love of her life during a flight, who had been kidnapped and diverted to Hawaii. On seeing the writer, Tom does not recognize her. Jai, realizing that Tom has stayed all night at the writer, encourages Tom to go talk to her. Tom doesn't. But the next day, at the reception of the hotel where he was staying, he sees a writer, and has the courage to introduce himself. She was Sarah Simon. That there was already recognized in the restaurant. But Tom, it would take almost 3 days to realize that the writer was the same girl who was in the armchair next to him, during the longest flight of his life. Tom remembered that during the 40 seconds he talked to her at the hotel reception, she given him a copy of her book. When opening it, he sees that in addition to it has been autographed, Sarah's phone is written. Tom calls Sarah. They go out to talk. And they talked a lot that afternoon. And finally found out how much they have in common. At a certain time in the night they both started talking together, how much time they lost, and how they should have continued talking to each other. Sarah asks Tom to throw a coin in the river and promise she would not lose sight of him again. Tom doesn't tell Sarah about what happened to his old passion. Sarah and Tom decide to travel together in Europe. They go by train to Madrid, then to Rome. It was when by a work of destiny, the train derails, and leaving some people very wounded. All of Brazil is moved to see the report on the news, showing a Brazilian had become a hero that day, after helping more than 10 people get off the train line, and take shelter away from high-voltage cables, until arrival of firemen. NBC reporters ask like Tom, how did he find the strength to help so many people? He answers that he just thought a lot about his family and friends. Scared by the accident, Sarah decides to go to see her family, but as they still don't know Tom, he decides to stay in Lisbon, and wait for Sarah returns, and tells Sarah that he has fulfilled his promise, and won't leave there until she gets back. Sarah says she would be back soon. Tom so takes Sarah to the airport. But when Tom was going back to the hotel, he had a surprise that made his spine freeze. He feels a person holding him by the shoulder. When turning to see who it was, he cannot believe who was there in front of him, saying, "Tom, it is me. I am here." Entirely pale, Tom could not believe what was happening. Isabella du Vail, the saxophonist, was right there, standing in front of him. Tom didn't know how to ask her how she could be alive. But Isabella knew Tom had a lot of questions, and promises to explain everything. They spend the afternoon talking. Isabella says that on the night of the flight, after getting on the airplane, they had had a panic attack, because several things are suddenly changing in her life. Without knowing what to do, she leaves the plan and goes back home. Some hours later she knows about the disappearance of the flight. Isabella is paralyzed, and can't even leave the apartment for 20 more days. In this period, Isabel, trying to calm down and put a little order in her life, starts to read some old emails. There was an email from a foundation that recruited teachers as volunteers to teach in indigenous tribes. Isabella, see this an opportunity to redo your life. She goes to northern Brazil, right in the middle of the Amazonas, to teach at an indigenous school. The natives receive her well and she ends up getting very clinging to the people. Isabella starts to transmit her knowledge about geology, renewable resources and soil transformation, and even about music. The time, Isabella stays in the tribe for almost 3 years. She says that when she saw Tom on TV, she realized that he was in Lisbon, through the landscape in the background, and that made her think about everything and everyone she had left behind. Tom realizes that Isabella is very different from before. Her beautiful red hair was much darker now. He realizes that she was no longer that person, who always told friends to run after their dreams. Isabella didn't show all that ambition from before. Instead, she said that she stopped worrying so much about life. Yes, really she was very different. That time with the tribe had changed her life. Isabella says she is extremely happy to review Tom. But he also said that he will return to Brazil to continue his work in the tribe. Isabella leaves Tom in Lisbon and returns to Brazil. But it was when he arrived in the tribe that Isabella crashed in his feelings, realizing the weight of everything that no longer belonged to her life. In all those years missing, Isabella had not gave news even to her parents, and even going to Lisbon, didn't have the courage to go to their house. Isabella drives to the village leader, saying that she has returned. At that moment, unable to hold her tears, she backs to her dormitory, and stays there all afternoon. The tribe head is a very old Saturday. He knew that type of sadness could only be for one reason. In the middle of the night, the tribe head goes to where Isabella sleeps, wakes up, and asks her to follow him. The two walk for a few hours into the forest. Then they arrive to the place where there was a well of water. Airplane small stones on the floor around the water. The chief covers Isabella's eyes and asks her to get in the water and sit down. He also asks she not to be afraid. And just remember a happy day, and focus on as many details as you can. By being exhausted, Isabella finds sleeping quickly. On awakening. The next day, Isabella's surprise was great. She was no longer in a forest. The sound of a bird has gone to the shull of cars and traffic. Isabella opens her eyes, and sees she's inside an apartment room. There were walls, curtains, and a window that Isabella raised quickly to look at. And the view was subtly familiar. When seeing the landscape, Isabella realizes that she was in her apartment, in Amparo. Running, Isabella down the stairs and goes to the square, to see someone known. When getting there, she hears someone calls her by name. There was Tom waving his hands while asking for his saxophone. Shocking, Isabella didn't understand what was happening. Tom and Isabella spend all morning talking. But she didn't have the courage to ask Tom if that was reality, or if it was just a dream. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching so far. I'm Jay Marcio, creator of this project, and this story is not over. It will be produced 4 chapters, so please leave a like, and share with as many people that you think like this content type. It is very important that you know, this project has your support. The goal for the next chapter is of $1,000, to be produced in the current design, but if it hit the $5,000 mark, the following chapters will be produced on realistic 3D illustration, like DAZ 3D, and Unreal Engine. Donations links are in the description of this video. Critical questions or suggestions, you can leave here in the comments below. It will be a pleasure to read each one. Thank you so much, God bless you, and until the next time.